Well, hello everyone. Yes, perhaps a bit of an eccentric topic, but I think still kind of topical, particularly in the aftermath of Joey's excellent talk. Really, discussion is about the intersections of respectability politics and its effects on marginalized communities, about notions of expertise, community identification, and things that can sometimes systematically keep neurodivergent workers out of library spaces, and also giving us some reason to reflect on, again, the ways in which money and financial interests affect the expert judgments and who we identify as an expert and how that relates to, when we give information literacy instruction. So you might, I don't know how many of you people going into this are familiar with this fellow here. This is Chuck Tingle. That's what everyone knows Chuck Tingle as. That is Chuck Tingle. That is Chuck Tingle's face for all intents and purposes. But before I begin, I would just like to give a land acknowledgement. This work was done on the lands of the Tlachtl within Secwepemc Ulu, the traditional and unceded territory of the Secwepem. Specifically, I am in Squeleton, or Williams Lake, British Columbia. Respect the treaties. Decolonization is not a metaphor. Usually when I give a land acknowledgement, I donate a loonie to the Orange Cert Foundation here in Williams Lake. I don't have a loonie right now, so I'm donating a toonie. And I'm just keep on putting that aside. I started this process last year. I've donated over $50, which isn't a lot in the larger scheme of things, but it just kind of highlights how often we do this. And if everyone did that, it would represent a substantial shift of resources towards truth and reconciliation purposes. Positioning myself, again, thank you for that introduction, Dr. Ben Mitchell. My background is a Nova Scotian British settler from rural Mi'kma'ki. In terms of my settler colonial positionality and legacy, nope. The Mitchells are the reasons why there's no more oysters in Oyster Pond, Jador, Nova Scotia there, right? So that's a thing to acknowledge. Even the ways in which colonialism has affected my life. My mother was a lower class Brit, but was able to come to Canada and be a British nanny. So that even then, those colonial relationships have benefited me. Also, in an ongoing investigation by the Halifax Examiner, I am related to Verdun Mitchell, who was, and I quote, the rot at the core of Halifax's police and justice system. So that's an ongoing thing that we have yet to learn some of the details about. A few trigger warnings also before we begin, some just kind of ableism, transphobia, homophobia, potentially psychosis. If these things are particularly upsetting to you, step back, take your time, look after yourself. I understand. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with this event that happened. Author Chuck Tingle, who's known for doing sometimes they're just considered to be joke things by the broader public, but he has a very particular theory of art and philosophy of art. They're oftentimes queer erotica with very eccentric covers and concepts and spaces. But this is a known thing. He was a Hugo Award nominee several times. He frequently chats with Neil Gaiman on social media, like a figure that not everyone knows about. He's kind of niche, but still a literary figure. And because of this, was invited to the Texas Library Association's annual conference. However, and everyone knows him as that person with the mask on his face. At some point, though, he was asked to not wear the mask. It would make people uncomfortable. This is a thing that you shouldn't be doing. But that's Chuck Tingle, right? So because of all of this, he was disinvited from it, which caused this further backlash, some broken trust. A lot of things happened behind the scenes, which I don't know about. I don't know if I fully know about. It's uncertain if it was ableism or just not thinking it's weird or some homophobia and other things put in there. There's a lot of speculation about why this happened, but the sum result of it was that Tingle decided not to go ultimately, right? And he's very specific about the reasoning why on his Tumblr posts, right? Saying that he considers this to be an accessibility feature, right? And I kind of get this myself as an autistic adult. I don't necessarily feel like I need to wear a mask, but there's a lot of things which I would think of as being accessibility features for me that other people wouldn't necessarily understand. Why it's so hard for me, for instance, to work in an office where there's a window where I'm just constantly exposed to people walking by my office, and that that triggering aspect of my brain that I can't fully relax or even focus with all that stuff happening. And they say, well, you can't actually cover your window because that's a safety issue, but it's exhausting, or not being able to filter out ambient sounds, and so always wearing a headset and listening to music throughout the day when my brain gets extra tired more quickly that way because I'm using sounds to drown out other sounds, but it's still I'm not actually appreciate being able to process silence in a way that helps me function. right? I don't wear, for another personal example, I don't wear sunglasses indoors as often as I'd like to because of the ways in which a lot of artificial lights, particularly at the institution I currently work at, they don't, it's not agonizing, but it is a consistent low-grade discomfort for me in the ways that the lights are set up with very few windows there. There's a whole bunch of things that I do, or that rather I should say I don't do, to accommodate those around me because I fear social reprisals. And I'm not necessarily a full-on mask wearer like Chuck Tingle is. But when I saw this, I was like, I know why this would seem weird. I'm fully aware of that. But I also understand that it is necessary, and that if we actually want to take, our resistance to respectability politics seriously, it's something that we should be aware of within library spaces. The rooms for eccentricity, rooms for being odd. Sometimes when I give talks like this, people say, oh, also like, if someone's being just like making other people really uncomfortable by saying misogynistic or racist things, is that just a neurodivergent things that we have to accept? And of course not, right? There's a difference between just being weird and being abusive or being racist or all those sorts of things. It's a bit of a straw man, but I feel like I have to mention it because it comes up in these discussions. Right. There's also a very good Library Punk podcast interview with Chuck Tingle about that event. If you're interested, that's more room for follow-up later. And this is actually quite a common charge against autistic people in their digital spaces, right? There's a Reddit subforum called Fake Disorder Cringe, where a lot of folks who are neurodivergent, you're just doing it for attention. You're just doing it to, to like show you have power over other people, right? You're just, you're doing it because you want special privileges. Like there's a lot of parallels between kind of ableist discourses and neurodivergence and other forms of ableist discourses or other forms of marginalizing discourses around the special treatment kind of claims, right? A lot of people these days don't even think that like, autism or, ADHD are real things, just point blank, right? How can you actually say what another person's full sensory psychological experience of the world is, particularly if you don't have a frame of reference for it, right? So it is very easy, I think, to undermine own voice speakers within this area. And it's very common, right? One thing that I think back onto, because I'm at this point an elder millennial, but in the turn of the century, it seemed like all of the cartoons I was watching or people I knew were watching basically had the thesis that ADHD was fake and you just needed to sort those kids out, right? There was this period in the turn of the 2000s where you see it in The Simpsons, you see it in South Park, you see it in King of the Hill. It was just very on trend to make fun of ADHD as being a fake condition or a fake experience. And I think about the ways in which these kinds of like cultural media kind of things have happened in recursive cycles over time. And one that I've thought a little bit about, but I think is like, it really like tests the limits of what people think of as respectable are things like dissociative identity disorder. I myself am not DID, but I've definitely been in periods where I've been in enough trauma and isolated enough that I felt my personality splintering in a way that was unusual. I never entirely lost sense of who I was, but it was like the relationship of the palm of your hand to your fingers. It was getting very intense. And because of that, then later on, in life, when actually like I met people who claimed to be plurals, multiple people in one body, I was just like, yeah, I can see how that happens. I do not personally directly experienced it, but it's a thing. And there's a whole, DID community. They have plural kits, like I'm showing here for on Discord. Now, there's Tumblr discussion, social media stuff, things. And again, like in any other area, there's a question of like, well, is this real? What are these people doing? Are they just doing intervention? The same things. I think this is one that I really think it's important to be mindful of because I feel like most of us in the room right now, hopefully, will acknowledge that like ADHD and autism exist, that we exist, that we're people, we have different experiences. I feel like DID is still considered more fringe as an idea than that, and it's still hotly contested whether or not it exists, except for the fact that there are a lot of people who self-identify as such, and that's arguably enough that there is a community there. And importantly, it's mostly encountered through media that makes people seem, dangerous, right? This is I'm not going to go on this one too much, but generally my experience, people who are DID would rather have their internal community acknowledged and be in harmony rather than being integrated in the removal of those pluralities from them. And this is part of the kind of like social psychological kind of research around that. But one thing all of these things have in common that I want to talk about is the concept of social contagion, right? Because it's a more kind of scholarly kind of term for, so scholarly sounding, I should say, term for, oh, everyone's doing it because it's just popular. It's kind of like you might have heard the term of use trender. It's kind of the neurodivergence kind of like equivalent of that in these spaces, right? Now, social contagion is a concept. It comes from somewhere, oftentimes in terms of self-harm and suicide in communities, measures of those kinds of like, the way in which really intense things can travel through a society. But it's also very frequently used to discredit marginalized people. And I've been involved in like, protests about this particular text in the past. Abigail Shrier's transphobic book, Irreversible Damage, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters from 2020, is fundamentally predicated on this idea of, like gender differences, being trans is a social contagion. And it follows a very similar pattern. Really, there's a lot of overlap between transphobia and neuromysia, or ableism against neurodivergent folks. And there's, like I said, a lot of discourse about it. This is Alexander Avila is a YouTube video essayist. Their video TikTok Gave Me Autism, The Politics of Self-Diagnosis, because there is a lot of politics contained in who has the authority to identify someone else as a part of a community or not part of a community, and what that means, right? It's it has some similar features, but also very different from the ways in which within Indigenous communities, there's a lot of politics and, like things involved in identifying who isn't part of an Indigenous community, right? But importantly, the debates over social contagion often frame neurodivergent people as intrinsically pathological, right? This is the pathology paradigm, which is sick and lesser than, right? Generally, if we're not isolated, passive, and deferential to medical and state authorities, then we must be faking it, just in it for the social capital, right? And if you've existed online, you've probably seen this a lot. But it's not just, Reddit trolls that are kind of invested within this kind of rhetoric and worldview, right? It's also professionals. In this particular case, this one example of an article in the Psychiatric Times, Psychoeducation or Psychiatric Contagion by Paul Weigel, MD, specifically talking about this issue, right? But like in Dr. Weigel's case is basically that it's fake, right? That it's just we're overly medicalizing it and all of this. And I thought it was quite interesting because when I was doing this research, I looked into some of Dr. Weigel's sources, right? Like that one there, like it's a big, clearly he wants people to pay attention to it. It bloated up. That's definitely not a word, but it's made large on the screen. One review of 500 mental health advocate advice videos on TikTok found 84% to be inaccurate. I'm like, okay, there's a little number 4 there. Let's investigate that, shall we? Well, that actually references to this article here by an organization called PlushCare. When you look up, like, well, who's the PlushCare team? What does it mean? Well, it's just medical doctors, nurses, and health experts who just enjoy writing about health topics. It's just for funsies, right? They don't necessarily like. I feel like peer review processing, they'd have specific names and people associated with this. When you actually look into PlushCare as an organization, or sorry, I'll go into the study a little bit more. Some of the things about this actual study that they cite, things like this, is the host unqualified and doesn't provide a disclaimer, right? So if the person, doesn't feel the need to, or only in one video but not in other ones, doesn't say, I don't have a medical degree, then that's by definition under this study, misinformation. Do they encourage self-diagnosis? So even people like the social psychologist, Dr. Devon Price, who is a professional who does encourage self-diagnosis, anything that he does would be considered medical misinformation under this study, right? Just by definition, it precludes the possibility of a liberatory politics or own voice speakers having authority over themselves, their experiences, recognizing patterns in their community. So the ways that these studies are set up, oftentimes when they talk about notions of expertise and false diagnosis and self-diagnosis, the framing kind of like data sets preclude the possibility of neurodiversity as a paradigm even, right? And that's something you have to understand going into these kinds of studies, that is very much often the case. And when I looked into PlushCare a little bit deeper, first of all, it's a for-profit virtual healthcare company, right? It's not from a research institute. It's not associated with a university. And it's been involved in a number of class action lawsuits, specifically involving their pricing, right? This would qualify as a conflict of interest. They have a vested interest in people not feeling like they have the authority to self-identify as neurodivergent, right? So this is already like compromised at that level. And looking even further into Dr. Paul Beagle, right, he does a lot of simping for app companies. If you actually look at some of his other publications, being kind of a spokesperson for that industry. This is another one which isn't quite as, suspect as that one, but the reach and accuracy of information on autism on TikTok from July 2023. Now, this article, again, it's not as overtly suspect as the previous one, but it does clump all kinds of autism discourse together. So, it lumps together those who are suggesting, like, oh, your kid's autistic, give them bleach and they won't be anymore, which is bad and awful, I should stress, with autistic self-advocates. If you just see a total equivalence between those two groups, you are deeply not understanding the cultural, political, social, medical dialogues happening here. Right. And even in this case, the adoption of an antagonistic stance against diagnostic or intervention protocols is enough to qualify as misinformation, right? So if you're suspicious of things like Autism Speaks or like people trying to find genetic cures for autism to make sure we don't exist anymore, that in and of itself precludes you from being an expert in this particular study. And I think if you haven't seen Dr. Devon Price's work, I highly recommend you check it out, right? This is just a full, I won't read the full quote here. Just checking the time. Oh, I can't check the time, but I can't move the, okay, fine. It says, if autism is a benign, neutral, naturally occurring form of human difference that requires acceptance rather than a cure, then there's no need to diagnosis, right? Generally, within our own communities, we hold the collective wisdom, organizing power, insight, and political power to define who we are without authority figures giving us, signing off on our identities, right? This is, thank you. This is an important thing to keep in mind. So, it's like any kind of group formation, we know our own. And once we have a better sense of ourselves, right? Like some cases, social contagion is just a way of, making learning more about yourself and your community sound scary, right? Before I knew the full scope of, for example, what even is gender? Once you have a view of gender that goes beyond, genital divination, then it really opens up an entire different space for you to think about your own gender. And like, okay, maybe I'm not binary. Like I don't really get, there's a term autigender, and but if I had no frame of reference, I'm just like, I don't know. I'm fine if you say so. I'll go into that category if those are my only options, right? It's from a place of ignorance, right? That lack of awareness of possibilities, in contrast, a place of greater knowledge allows you to form those communities. So then I was just talking social contagion or just social, right? We tend to congregate with others like ourselves for the same reason that any marginalized group does. And the burden of proof of harm is on those concerned trolling about, making people uncomfortable by being ourselves. And maybe we do overgeneralize sometimes, right? I'm also a Scotian. If I say the year was 1778, then Nova Scotians in the rooms are compelled, like sleeper agents, to activate and reply, how I wish I was in Sherbrooke now. A letter of muck came from the king to the scummiest vessel I'd ever seen, God damn them all. Right? I don't know. It's a thing. It's an aspect of having a culture. So ultimately, in conclusion, the popular fake disorder cringe is the professional, social, or contagion, and shares many similarities with homophobic and transphobic discourses. And I would argue that libraries feed into systems of oppression by playing into these respectability politics. Who do you invite to give own voice talks? When was the last time you invited, to give an own voice talk to someone who's DID or schizophrenic? You're going to get a very different kind of talk than if you ask someone like me who's a relatively well-presenting autistic adult. I've been told that anyway in a range of ways. Like I conform, or at least I conform to people's expectations more than other members of the neurodivergent community. That's something to reflect on, right? Academic library instruction, I think, also could be doing more for the importance of own voice positionalities and standards of evidence, specifically when it comes to pathologized communities. Right? I spend my time doing some liaison work with nursing, and I find that just from my overview of some of the kind of like nursing liaison and medical liaison work, people in those positions very seldom do a lot of their information literacy instruction from a position of like even just patient-centric views or service user views or neurodivergent views, disability justice, critical disability studies. It's almost like that whole huge area of research going back decades very seldom seems to actually be in dialogue with a lot of medical practice and like medical institutions. And that's a problem. That's a huge problem. And hopefully that is at least one particular point of intersection where librarians, because we do kind of get into those spaces in the ways that, more actually like critical disability scholars and neurodiversity scholars don't often, we have more room to actually like foreground those kinds of views to understand what it actually means to be forced to participate in medicalized systems. So that's all for me, managing to actually keep it relatively short today. Thank you kindly. Again, my name is Ben Mitchell, he, they. I'm on, there's my email address. I'm on Blue Sky and also on Tumblr because I'm that kind of weirdo. Thank you kindly for listening, and I look forward to hearing any questions you might have. Cheers.